Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Very Cold Lasagna podcast. I'm your host, DylanLasagna, and this is episode number 206 of this icy yet spicy podcast with all the filthy casual takes on the world of sport. And in this episode, we are here continuing along with our 2024 NFL season preview month as we wrap up the National Football Conference side of things as we talk about the last division on that list, that being the teams that reside in the NFC East. So that being said, in case you missed the other parts of our NFL season preview month 2024, after this episode, make sure you listen to the 3 episodes covering the other 3 divisions in the NFC, that being the NFC West, the NFC North, and the NFC South. Make sure you check out those episodes after this one covering the NFC East. That being said, I'm not going to go into further dilly-dallying, no more delegating with this one. If you watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the subscribe button. If you're not subscribed already, which you should, by the way, make sure you smash the like button and leave a comment down below with your own takes on each and every episode topic, this one being the NFC East and the 4 teams residing in it. If you're listening to this on audio, whether it be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you rate and review the show 1 to 5 stars and leave me some feedback or some nice thoughts or not so nice thoughts as well. And make sure you follow the show on social media on Twitter and Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. And as always, make sure you share this filthy casual show with your friends, your neighbors, your strangers, your colleagues, wherever it may be. Make sure you share the good, the bad, the ugly about this show for casual fans known as Very Cold Lasagna. That being said, let's get right into it. Let's talk about the last division in the NFC going into 2024, known as the NFC East. So, looking back at last year, when I was giving my little prelude for this entire division going into 2023, it was pretty much a one team. In my opinion, I thought it was a one team race. It could have been a 2, but in all honesty, one team easily could have ran away with this division because one of these teams was the NFC champions from last year, but they came a little bit short of winning the Super Bowl. And that certain team in the city of brotherly love, they actually had a great opportunity to pull a Cody Rhodes and quote unquote finish the story. What do I mean by that? Well, Cody Rhodes, the current WWE champion, he lost at WrestleMania 39, but then he went on this kinda-ish journey of hard times and hardships, which not really, it wasn't really. But anyway, that's besides the point. Cody Rhodes lost at WrestleMania 39, his first major championship opportunity, and then at WrestleMania 40, he won it. He won the WWE Championship by beating Roman Reigns. So, in this instance, this certain team from the city of brotherly love, they came up just a bit short of winning the Super Bowl, and they had a great opportunity to go back there and actually win it. Unfortunately for them, they fell apart late in the season, and that allowed their most hated rival in the Big D down in the Big T to swoop in and take the division for themselves. But at the end of the day, though, when it came down to their season and how it ended, they would get sent packing in the most embarrassing of fashions in the first round of the playoffs. So when you look at this division going into 2024, here we are, several months later. Either of those teams are either still favored to win the division, barring those changes, regardless of those changes in this coming fall. So who knows? Either one of those teams could still be favored to win that division. But there's still one team that I wouldn't discount in regards to their rebuild down in the nation's capital that, could still make some noise. So that being said, let's talk about all these teams and where their chances lie as we talk about the last team, the last division in this NFC, and that is the NFC East. So kicking off part 4 of our 2024 NFL season preview month is a team that resides in the nation's capital, but they're undergoing a significant rebuild currently, and that team is the Washington Commanders. The Commanders in 2023, well, some people thought that this was for real, but most of them thought that this is not a real undefeated start. So Washington started off 2-0, but they really weren't going anywhere after that, because prior to that season, there was significant change abound, because out goes former owner Dan Snyder. He sells the team to Philadelphia 76ers owner Josh Harris, and he comes in with an ownership group to buy the team. And you damn know well that's finally, in the eyes of Commanders fans and pretty much around the NFL, that real change was coming to the nation's capital. And I don't mean like change like, oh, they're just gonna like brush it off like that. No, real change was coming. So this 2023 for them, it pretty much went as expected for them. Their major deficiencies eventually began to show across the board, especially at offensive line and unfortunately quarterback, because Sam Howell wasn't as bad as people said he was, because sure, he made a lot of mistakes. He crumbled under the pressure of the talent deficiency around him. But when you look at the talent deficit, it was pretty bad. But again, not all Sam Howell's fault. Regardless, the rebuild was pretty much underway as expected in DC, as the Commanders limped their way to a 4-13 finish, but it was for the best. So this past offseason, the change was really underway. They replaced Martin Mayhew, starting with him. They replaced him with 49ers assistant general manager Adam Peters as their new general manager. Adam Peters, coming from the 49ers, the assistant to John Lynch. So he brings in some experience of trying to build a winning team. So at least the Commanders are starting good there. Now they comes to the head coach. They replaced Ron Rivera with former Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn as their head coach. So Dan Quinn, it's been a little while since he was an actual head coach. The last time we saw him in that position was during his time with the Atlanta Falcons, and well, we know how that went in after Super Bowl 51. But that was quite a while ago. So during this time in Dallas, obviously we know how he was with that strong Cowboys defense, but unfortunately the last mark with that Cowboys defense didn't go so well. Nonetheless, it'll be interesting how that works out for him. And he brought some notable names to his coaching staff, like former Cardinals head coach Cliff Kingsbury as its offensive coordinator. And coming with him from Dallas was his secondary coach, Joe Witt, as his defensive coordinator. So again, interesting how that will play out. And then he knew that real change was coming when they were finally going to get their own quarterback, as Sam Howell was traded away to the Seahawks in return for third and fourth round picks from this year's draft. So real change, significant change was coming for the Washington Commanders and their fans this year, as like I said, the rebuild was well underway for this group, and that continued into free agency. They added a lot of players, and they let some names go, but not too much of notice, like Curtis Samuel. He goes on to the Bills. Kendall Fuller, he goes on to the Patriots, but that might be a little bit of a loss of sus there. Probably a little bit of a big hit to the Commander secondary was Cameron Curl. He had a pretty good season for them, despite everything that went on in 2023. He might be a kind of big loss for them. Hopefully, the Commanders replaced him. So looking at some of their big name additions this past offseason, that goes in the pass rush, trying to replace Montez Sweat, as well as Chase Young. They let him go too to the 49ers via trade. So they tried to replace both of them with Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler. At least for Dorrance Armstrong, he was a key contributor in the Cowboys defensive line when Dan Quinn was there. And then going on the other side of the trenches, they got a key piece to their horrific offensive line and trying to improve that. Tyler Blazdas from the Cowboys as well. So beefing up that interior was a big must for Washington, as I noted in my team needs in their recap this past March. Some other notable additions for them was getting guard Nick Allegretti from the Kansas City Chiefs. So a kind of proven guard from a Super Bowl winning team coming over. Also, you get running back Austin Eckler from the Chargers, and also linebacker Bobby Wagner from the Seahawks. But just like with other teams that I noted on here, the draft is where the Commanders really did their damage in terms of trying to improve their roster. And that started with the second overall pick, getting the quarterback that they wanted, and that was by the name of Jaden Daniels from LSU. Now, from the small snippets that I've seen of this guy, he looks pretty good. And I say that with a lot of layers, but he seems like out of the entire quarterbacks in this class, he seems like he has the most upside, most with his multi-play ability, scrambling out of the pocket pretty well, and getting that ball out really quick. So it'll be interesting to see how he translates that into the NFL. He apparently he completes a lot of his passes very good. It's like a good percentage ratio. It's like a pretty good percentage when it comes to TDs, interceptions. Of course, I'm not a stats guy, but again, he performs pretty well during his college days. So other notable additions that the Commanders made in the draft was mainly on the defensive side, like Jerzon Noon from Illinois, and then corner Mike Zanstrill from Michigan, and then getting a little bit of help for Jaden Daniels as well. Was receiver Luke McCaffrey, Christian McCaffrey's brother from Rice. So when you look at the Commanders' offseason, I mean, it's clear that their rebuild can now get fully underway. They now have their head coach. They now have a GM that clearly has committed to, getting his guys, his coach, his quarterback. Now fans can see what year one is going to look like under the new look Washington Commanders. Speaking of that offensive line, probably looking at the team itself, the offensive line should be a lot better because that was a major priority. I was hoping that they would address this past offseason, especially the interior blocking, because Sam Howell took a shit ton of hits, like the most in the NFL. I think he broke a record for like most sacks this past year or last year. So the Commanders were like, no, we're not going to do that to whoever's going to be our quarterback next. So they went out and actually upgraded the offensive line, especially in the interior. By one question mark is the exterior. Sure, they have right tackle Andrew Wiley, who was okay last year, but now they have to address the other side, the left tackle spot, because obviously you don't want to have like major flaws on either side or either spot in the offensive line, because protecting Jaden Daniels is gonna be your priority. Like, protecting him is gonna be a must if you're the Commanders. So obviously going into 2024, you want to have a good rookie year out of your new quarterback Jaden Daniels. How is he gonna translate into the NFL? I'm not sure what the upside is gonna look like, but it should be fun to watch. So looking at some of their key games going into this season, you start on the road. You play the Tampa Bay Bucks. Should be an exciting matchup between Baker Mayfield and Jaden Daniels. See the two former first overall picks duke it out. And then you come home to play the New York Giants in an NFC East division matchup. And then you go back on the road to play Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals. So these are kind of three early first tests for these new look Commanders. So when you look at this team, it's going to be some interesting things to watch. Like I said, Jaden Daniels, how is he going to look in his rookie year? What is he going to look like? Is he going to do good? Is he going to do bad? And then also for Dan Quinn, what is his coaching style going to be like? What new or old is he going to bring to the table? It's been like 5 years since he last was a head coach, and I get it. He did pretty well for himself when he was the Dallas defensive coordinator, but yeah, being a coordinator and a head coach are two different things. So it'll be interesting to see what new things he's bringing to the table since his last time out in Atlanta. So after 2 decades of Dan Snyder's shittiness, it's finally a new era for Washington football. And I don't mean Washington football team, that name. Washington football. They utilized nearly every single resource this past offseason to upgrade the most glaring weaknesses from the last 5 years, especially with quarterback. Like that carousel of quarterbacks we've seen, especially in the last several years, it was seriously bad. Like after Kirk Cousins left. But now you get a foundational quarterback with Jayden Daniels, and you still have a pretty good supporting cast around him. Now, they still have a couple of holes to sort out, and we have to see what Daniels will really look like. But if things play right for them, Washington can take its first step in commanding some winning ways this coming season. So let's move on from the nation's capital to the Big Apple as we talk about the blue side of that Big Apple, and that is the New York Giants. The Giants, man, what a year it has been for them, because 2023 was not kind to them at all, because they got off to a horrific start thanks to terrible play all around, especially from the regression of Daniel Jones, their quarterback. And that was made even worse by the fact that, well, key injuries really started to happen early in the season and then midway through the season with a torn ACL to Daniel Jones. And, well, it's pretty much further down from there. And the Giants were also being bad in nearly every game the rest of the way, as their season ended 6-11. But heck, they at least ended the season on a bright note by upsetting the Philadelphia Eagles in their last regular season finale. So that was at least a bright spot for them. But still, they had serious questions that they had to answer, especially when it came to the quarterback position with Daniel Jones and whether he would be ready for the season and what he would look like. So looking at some of the things that they did this past offseason, they traded to help out their defense. They traded for the likes of Panthers edge rusher Brian Burns. So Brian Burns, who was a little bit unsure if he wanted to play under the franchise tag with Carolina, he was traded to the New York Giants and was also given a big back contract by New York in return for this year's 2nd and 5th round picks. So he should be a big help to help out Dexter Lawrence and that Giants kind of lackluster defensive line. So it definitely a big help for them. And then they also made a little bit of a coaching change for Brian Dable's staff. Replacing Wink Martindale as defensive coordinator is Shane Bowen in that same role. Now, Shane Bowen comes in from the Tennessee Titans, who last served as their defensive coordinator. So his scheme will be a little bit different. He's not the bull rush type kind of coach, but he's more of let's play it out. Let's wait and see how this plays out. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out for that Giants pass rush that just added a quality pass rusher. And then offensively, they lost tight end Darren Waller to retirement. It was, I don't know, I think when I remember correctly, when I last saw that news, he was doing a lot of interesting off the field stuff. Like, I think he was making a rap album, from what I remember correctly. And then he was more focused on music than actually doing on-field work. I don't know. It was interesting how that worked out. But yeah, there's one thing that they had to address in the offseason, finding Darren Waller's replacement. So anyway, when you look at the Giants and what they need to do for 2024, they want to be somewhat competitive with Daniel Jones because, well, it's been down since their last playoff appearance in 2022. So looking at some of the moves that they made this past offseason, it was a little bit interesting when you look at it, because they lost some key players on both sides of the ball, especially offensively. They let Saquon Barkley go to a division rival. They let him go to the Eagles. What the hell? They seriously didn't want to sign him? Wow. That's rough. That's really rough. And then they also let safety Xavier McKinney go to the Packers. A key player on their defense is now up north, which is also a curious choice, but I guess they didn't want to pay him. And then they also let edge rusher A'Shawn Robinson go to the Panthers. So to try and counter all this, they added running back Devin Singletary from the Texans. And then they tried to beef up their offensive line, which was horrific, and they really need to address that by getting guard Jermaine Elamunor from the Raiders, who was decent. Guard John Runyan from the Packers, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then just in the case of emergency situation, they added a backup quarterback by the name of Drew Lock from the Seahawks. Now, in terms of the draft, some of the key names that they got in this draft were receiver Malik Nabers from LSU, who was a big target name for Jaden Daniels during their time together there, and should be a good downfield threat. Finally, a downfield threat for Daniel Jones this coming season. But we'll talk more about that and why I question it a little bit in a little bit. And then some other notable names was tight end Theo Johnson from Penn State, who should serve as the replacement for Darren Waller, and then running back Tyrone Tracy from Purdue. So when you look at the Giants offseason and how that translates into 2024, the only thing I could say is that, yeah, this is going to be largely dependent on Daniel Jones again. This is despite one thing. There are so many issues. There are so many issues with this team. Now I get it. Daniel Jones, or as I like to call him, Danny Pennies, has often had his own fair share of issues, whether it be bad decision making, whether it be interceptions, throws, taking care of the football. But nonetheless, it's like there's still the Giants and its fan base are still going to heavily depend on him. Why? Like, there's other factors around that team. I'm not trying to defend. I'm not trying to suck on Daniel Jones' you-know-what, because I'm heavily critical of Daniel Jones, okay? But that being said, the guy is coming off a torn ACL. He's had serious issues around him that make them gonna cause serious problems for the Giants. They're gonna cause them to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. For starters, while he finally has a top receiver in Malik Nabers, much still has to be decided on who else is going to support him. Is it going to be Jalen Hyatt? Is it going to be Darius Slayton? Who's going to be at number 2 alongside Nabers and receiver number 3, Wan'Dale Robinson? And then looking at the backfield, is Devin Singletary going to be as effective as he was with the Texans in their late season stretch? That remains to be seen. It's going to be very difficult to replace Saquon Barkley. The key engine core to that offense, the glue that held the offense together. And then last but not least, the offensive line. I feel like the offensive line, despite getting a decent guard in Illuminor and then from the Packers, Ruin Yan, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that again. It's like, I feel like they didn't seriously commit to that again for whatever fuck all reason. So, like, when you combine all that together, you still expect me to believe that this season is dependent on Daniel Jones and Daniel Jones alone. Like, how do you expect him to overcome all that? How do you expect Daniel Jones to overcome, especially a shitty offensive line that, got him hurt in the first place? You ask me. So, looking at some of the key games going into the season, you start week 1 with the Minnesota Vikings. How's Daniel Jones going to look in his first game back from injury against a Vikings team that's going to trot out a new quarterback? And then you go to the nation's capital to face Jaden Daniels and the Commanders in a early key NFC East matchup. And then you play the Dallas Cowboys, host them only on Amazon Prime Video 2 weeks later. Fun stuff if you're the New York Giants, very early in the season. So when you look at them in 2024, I do ask, how much regret are they having about, giving Daniel Jones this big fat contract extension? And, again, this is no slight to Daniel Jones, but more so on their front office and their ownership. Because, especially when you consider that Saquon, yes, he has his own injury history, but he brings more to the table than Jones. Again, not Daniel Jones' fault, but, his own flaw sometimes rear its own ugly head, but more so the players around him, the supporting cast around him. So when you look at what happened last year, and then some parts of 2022 as well, you have to wonder, it's like, was it really worth giving Daniel Jones a big fat contract, especially now coming off a torn ACL? it's fair to wonder. And then, speaking of Saquon, where's that ground game going to come from? We're circling back to Devin Singletary. He's had a strong second half surge in the Texans' push for the AFC South title last year. But on top of that, he's been relatively inconsistent during his time in Buffalo and some parts of Houston, including that divisional game against Baltimore. Now, again, Baltimore's run defense is very strong, but he was like nowhere to be found in that game and putting a lot of pressure on CJ Stroud. And not helping his case was the piss poor blocking, or going to be the piss poor blocking, and the lack of quality backups behind him. So, where's the running game going to come from if you're the New York Giants? So, the Giants, they do have some positive things to look ahead to, like a very good defensive line with Brian Burns and Dexter Lawrence, and what Malik Nabers at receiver is going to look like in his first rookie year. But is it really going to matter with how flawed the rest of the team is, especially the surrounding pieces around Daniel Jones? Is it? You ask me. So, in my opinion, it's likely going to be another long year for these Giants, who, in my opinion, could end up near the bottom of the NFC and competing for a top 5 pick in next year's draft, especially if neither of those major issues that I mentioned all in this preview can be suddenly fixed. Seriously, it could be a long year if they don't fix this. So moving on to the city of brotherly love, and most recently where a certain story was finished, we take a look now at the team known as the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles in 2023 were looking to quote unquote finish the story because they were the favorites to win the Super Bowl a year after losing that Super Bowl to the Kansas City Chiefs. So they were looking to quote unquote again finish the story just 2 months before they got to host WrestleMania 40 in their home city. Unfortunately, their major flaws glared in a late season collapse that included seriously bad losses to the 49ers, the Cowboys, the Seahawks, the Cardinals. Do I dare go on and say the Giants as well? So they seriously collapsed in December of that year, and that all culminated, yes, they got into the playoffs, but it all culminated with an embarrassing wildcard beatdown by the Tampa Bay Bucks. So when you look at this past offseason for the Philadelphia Eagles, and all the criticism, per usual, from Philadelphia sports media, you knew that significant changes had to be made by this team, by Nick Sirianni and company. So that's exactly what they did. They underwent significant coaching changes, including replacing both their offensive and defensive coordinators, Brian Johnson and Sean Desai / Matt Patricia, because Matt Patricia took control of the defensive reins late in that collapse. So they replaced him with Kellen Moore, who last served as the Chargers offensive coordinator, and Vic Fangio, who was an advisor with the Philadelphia Eagles, but then now he's full-time as a defensive coordinator. So they also want to create some cap space, so they decided to give some of their key players some big fat contract extensions like receivers A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, offensive lineman Landon Dickerson and Jordan Mailata, as well as their top kicker Jake Elliott. So the two biggest notable names being given those extensions were obviously A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Jalen Hurts go-to players. So some of the losses that they did incur was center Jason Kelce, who was one of the best centers in the NFL and a key part to that offensive line. As on the other side of the trenches, defensive tackle Fletcher Cox, they lost them both to retirement. I mean, it's getting clear by that point that, their time was coming, and they did invest in resources to replace them. But, again, congratulations, though, to both of their careers and what they accomplished. And another notable event that I wanted to make note of was trading for a quarterback. Yes, it was a little suspect at first, but then I kind of understood why they did it. The Eagles, they decided to trade for Steelers quarterback Kenny Pickett in return of giving them a 3rd-round pick and a couple of 7th-round picks for next year's draft. So they needed a backup quarterback because I believe it was Marcus Mariota. He left in free agency. So now they went out to get a kind of project quarterback that can make a name for himself if he decides to leave too. So when you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, obviously, like I said, what was going to happen. They knew what happened last year when they failed to quote unquote finish the story. They collapsed badly in December and in the playoffs. So when you go into 2024, obviously your goal is to reclaim the NFC East and return back to the Super Bowl when you were the clear favorites from the season prior. So when you look at some of their other moves in free agency, they really didn't lose all that much, which, with the long, extensive list that I talked about in my season recap for this team, honestly, they didn't really lose. Looking at it back at it now, they didn't really lose a lot, which is good for them, So when you look at some of those losses, like Nicholas Morrow to the Bills, okay, he didn't really do a lot, and then DeAndre Swift to the Bears, he provided some spark. He provided a lot of spark for that team in the ground game, but I feel like a lot of the ground game was mostly Jalen Hurts. But speaking of that ground game, looking at the key addition to that offense, Saquon Barkley, they managed to nab him from the division rival Giants. I'll talk more why that's a big deal for this team. Defensively, that's where most of their free agent additions came from, like edge rusher Bryce Huff from the Jets. And they got back C.J. Gardner-Johnson from the Lions, so I guess they hugged and made up. So that's a thing. And then to help out their linebacking core, to help out their front seven, they got Devin White from the Bucks and Oren Burks from the Niners, because that middle of the field was severely lacking in their 2023. And then when you look at the draft, this is where they really did their dirty work, and like they really improved. So they went out, got some corners by the name of Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean from Toledo and Iowa, and then edge rusher Jalix Hunt from Houston Christian. And they also got a running back by the name of Will Shipley from Clemson. So those are just some of the key names that stood out to me in this draft, and as well as free agency. So when you look at this Eagles squad going into 2024, they've improved. They really improved an already loaded roster, especially in the passing defense. Because, like I said, they really need to make some changes if they want to keep their window open for a Super Bowl. The most important part of changes that need to be made was in their passing defense, because as I detailed like time and time again, their passing defense in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs was really bad, and it really got exposed all season long, not just in the collapse in December, but in their 10-0 win, in their 10-1, start to the season. So that was a reason why that Jalen Hurts had to practically lead these teams to their wins, their 10 wins that season, because their passing defense was horrible. Chase Bradbury and Darius Slay were like practically getting torched out there. So getting these top-notch corners in college in Mitchell and DeJean should ease some pressure off of Bradbury and Slay. And then you're also getting back C.J. Gardner-Johnson at safety from the Lions, which is a little bit of a surprise to me of sorts, considering like, oh, he said all that shit, and then now they hugged it out. Okay, that was a little interesting. So going back to Saquon Barkley, he should be a big help to ease off some of the load of Jalen Hurts from having to run on script so much. But again, that's going to depend on what Kellen Moore at offensive coordinator is going to script up. So, in my opinion, I feel like, they should like script a healthy balance of Saquon and Jalen, trying to run, script in some Saquon, just as long as he can stay healthy. So they did some pretty good things to patch up some rough stuff from last year. But now it's on whether Nick Sirianni can execute all of his new toys that are going to come into play come regular season time. So for the Eagles, they got a pretty mixed schedule going into this regular season. Some of the key games include starting their season in Brazil against the Green Bay Packers and Jordan Love, and a rematch from both Week 3 and the playoffs in Week 4 against the Tampa Bay Bucks and Baker Mayfield, and then a key game against the Dallas Cowboys in Week 10 much later on in the season, and then a road gauntlet that includes the LA Rams and the Baltimore Ravens. That should be a big test for these kind of new look Eagles. So when you look at this team, I mean, my big question for them is, what are these new coordinators like with Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio going to bring to the table? So obviously, this is the third straight year that the Eagles have had new coordinators for Nick Sirianni and company, because after Jonathan Gannon and the new Indianapolis head coach, that name keeps forgetting to me, but anyway, they leave for head coaching jobs after the Super Bowl in 2022, and then you bring in Ryan Johnson, and then Matt Patricia and Sean Desai. They fail miserably, and now you bring in Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio. They just better hope that these two stick past this year. They stick the landing on this, and it better be good for them. So it'll be interesting to see what schemes they bring up, what kind of like balance they have. Should be interesting. So for the Philadelphia Eagles, they clearly took the last month of 2023 personally. They really did. It's like, and then I took it personal. And they vastly improved their roster with much needed changes, especially in the passing defense, the offensive line, running back. So many to list. Now it remains to be seen how these changes translate over to the regular season, but the Eagles should be the clear favorite to win the NFC East again. So wrapping up part 4 of our 2024 NFL season preview month is the team down in the Big T, and that is the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys, oh man. Well, all I can say is they had yet another successful regular season campaign, going 12-5 for the second consecutive year, or is it the third? I don't know. But either way, they had another successful regular season campaign behind yet another MVP season like from quarterback Dak Prescott, and another strong defense. That defense, that pass rush, that secondary. It was an overall strong defensive effort, as it seemed like they were finally putting the pieces together for a serious title run and finally making the NFC Championship appearance that pretty much everyone keeps bugging them about. The NFC title game that they've never been to in the last 30 years. However, with all that being said, none of that mattered again in the playoffs. But this time, it was more humiliating. It was much more embarrassing than their last 2 playoff losses. And this one, they got fucked in the ass so hard that nearly everyone was leaving after the third quarter. They got their ass whooped by the 7th-seeded Green Bay Packers at home in one of the worst, if not the worst, playoff losses in their history. Rough. Just absolutely rough when you think about it. So they get their ass whooped by the Packers at home, and now you start to wonder, like, what are they ever going to get it done? Are they ever going to get it done? Especially when you consider that Dak Prescott is entering a contract extension negotiations, or could be entering the last year of his deal, why isn't Mike McCarthy getting fired for this shittiness? And is Jerry Jones going to do anything? So many questions on whether or not these Cowboys can ever get it done. Again, and again, and again. So, when you look at this Cowboys offseason, there really wasn't a lot of what they did because, well, of financial constraints and pretty much whether or not they were going to re-sign Dak Prescott to a big fat contract extension. So, some of the things that they did do that wasn't related to that was they went out to hire former Vikings head coach Mike Zimmer to replace Dan Quinn as defensive coordinator. Not because, Dan Quinn sucked at his job, but Dan Quinn had departed to become the new head coach for the Washington Commanders. So, obviously, with that change, they have to bring in a new defensive coordinator, mind you. And then, because they didn't have a lot of money to spend, and because of the contract negotiation with Dak, they didn't really have a lot of players that they either couldn't resign or they had to let go. But they did resign at least 1 or 2 players, like Rico Dodal at running back and corner CJ Goodwin. But that was pretty much it. So they also released receiver Michael Gallup, who unfortunately with that torn ACL a couple years ago, he slowed down. He slowed down a little bit. And I think for whatever reason lost trust with Dak. I don't know why. But anyway, he ends up going to the Raiders later on. And they also released linebacker Lane Vander Esch, who unfortunately had his career ended with the neck injury early in last year's season, which sucks. You never want your career to end like that, which is very unfortunate. So he gets released and then he retires. So that's very unfortunate. So when you look at these Cowboys, obviously, you know how it goes for them pretty much year and year and year. At this point, if you're a Cowboys fan or just like someone that loves to roast them, my only goal for them this year is like just do something damn meaningful if you make the playoffs. And that's if, again, you do make the playoffs. Like, you've been to the divisional playoffs. You reached there like how many times now? Ever since Dak has been there. And yet you can't get it done for whatever reason. You can't reach to the promised land, which is the NFC Championship game. Like, I really don't get it. So anyway, to try and get to that point, it's questionable. It's really questionable though, because look at what you've lost. You've lost Tony Pollard to the Titans, but more on him in a bit. And then you've lost a significant amount of power in your offensive line, like Tyron Smith to the Jets, Tyler Blasdaz to the Commanders, and then defensively, there's some key losses there as well, like Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler to the division rival Commanders. And then when you look at some of their additions, they were only two. And they weren't really strong ones either. Like Ezekiel, you at least bring back Ezekiel Elliott from the Patriots. So a little reunion there, but Ezekiel Elliott, I don't know. He hasn't been the same. It hasn't been the same since leaving Dallas. And then you bring linebacker Eric Kendricks from the Chargers. He should be a little bit of help, I guess, to replace Lane Vander Esch. But they tried to do something in the draft at least, like getting Tyler Guyan from Oklahoma at tackle, an edge rusher, Martin Nealon from Western Michigan, guard Cooper Beebe from Kansas State, and getting a receiver by the name of Ryan Flournoy from Southeastern Missouri State. So when you look at the Dallas Cowboys this past offseason and how does it translate over to 2024? There's two things I can say. Their one stout offensive line, they're gonna endure some pains pretty much all year because, like I said, two of their starters in Tyron Smith and Tyler Blasdaz, they're gone. They left in free agency, and sure they still have Tyler Smith at guard. They still have Zach Martin at center and Terrence Steele also at guard. At least your interior is set, but your exterior is going to be a little bit of an issue because you have these rookies. Cooper Beebe is at guard, and then Tyler Guyan is going to be where Tyron Smith was. So they're still going to have a serious adjustment period, and you know what that means for Dak Prescott? He's going to have to ditch that ball quick. There have been plenty of instances of where Dak Prescott really struggles when he doesn't have his full complementary offensive line at his disposal. So it's going to be a little bit of a rough transition period for this one stout Cowboys offensive line. And then defensively, there are concerns with this Dallas run defense, and which is a little surprising considering that, it really struggled last year. And I was wondering why they didn't address it because, considering that they got gashed on the ground, and they also allowed Jordan Love to really let that ball out, which is why they got their ass whooped in that playoff game back in January. Oh, I mean, I get it. They did address that in the 7th round, but there still isn't much there. There still isn't much interior defensive tackles to stop the run or generate any pressure from the inside against opposing quarterbacks going into this fall. Again, I might be wrong. There might be someone there that can step up to the plate. But as it stands now, there's nobody. There's nobody there. So when you look at some of their schedule this year, looking at some of their key games, they start on the road against the Cleveland Browns and that vaunted defense. And then they come home, they at home, week 3 against the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson. And then a rematch of sorts in that controversial Week 17 game against the Lions. They faced them in a rematch. And then coming off their bye week in Week 8, they go to San Francisco again to take on the 49ers. It should be an interesting game considering how that went last year and in the year before that in the playoffs. So should be an interesting one. Should be kind of a interesting schedule for the Dallas Cowboys, especially in the first half of the year. So for Dallas, there's a lot of things to be concerned about with this team. Not just with Dak, not just their offensive line, but yeah, a lot of concern comes from their offense. Like, where's the ground game going to come from? Last year, Tony Pollard was handling the starting role, but when you look back at some of his highlights, he didn't handle the starting role as well as most people thought. So now he's on the Titans. He left in free agency. Ezekiel Elliott's back there, but he's had a very mixed tenure in New England, and they re-signed Rico Dowdle, but we don't know too much about him, at least from an outsider's perspective. So it's going to be interesting how that ground game is going to work out. And if it does work out, good for them. But we still have some things to figure out there. And then at the receiver spot, who's going to be that downfield threat to help out CeeDee Lamb? Like, who's going to be that number 2 option? Because most thought it was going to be Brandon Cooks, but that wasn't the case because he was very inconsistent all year last year. And there weren't many reliable options besides those two. So is it going to be that other guy, that Ryan guy from Southeastern Missouri State? Who knows? But they don't really have many other receiving options besides CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks. You're going to need more than that. So the Cowboys, when you look overall, heading into 2024, they certainly lost a lot of pieces. But, I feel like they still did a decent job in trying to replace some of them, but not enough of a job to try to put them together and see, are they still going to compete in the playoffs? That's hard to say. In my opinion, though, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting how their schedule plays in their favor, especially when you have a rebuilt offensive line, the run defense, the running game, and Dak Prescott playing against quality competition. Sure, they're still in a kind of weak NFC because they play the NFC South. They have a couple opponents that are kind of but they could run into some trouble securing a playoff spot, let alone snatching the NFC East from the team that took it from them last year. Then, the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Cowboys, again, they could run into some trouble if they can't overcome their serious issues that I noted earlier. And that is a wrap on part 4 of our 2024 NFL season preview month, where we covered the NFC East division, which resides the Philadelphia Eagles, the Dallas Cowboys, the New York Giants, and the Washington Commanders. So let me know your expectations for them, whether it's in the comments on YouTube or a message on social media at @ColdLasagna, as well as your take on my expectations for all 4 of these teams. Let's have a discussion about it. Let's be civil. Let's be, of course, civil and respectful about it in the comments on YouTube or send me a message on social media. Either way, we're halfway through our 2024 NFL season preview month, and in the next episode, we'll be going over to the AFC side of our season previews. Which division will we start with? You'll just have to tune in and find out. Until then, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Very Cold Lasagna. I am your host, DylanLasagna, wrapping up this episode number 206 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. And until the next one, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of sports. And as always, peace out.